Good evening and welcome to the Cover One Buffalo podcast. You are joining your host, Greg Tompsett, and tonight we're going to continue on our series in evaluating the roster construction and team building strategy of Brandon Beane. And we thought tonight would be a good chance to go in and invite over another member of the Bills Mafia media family, and some that I'm sure many of you are familiar with from the very popular Nick and Nolan Show on the Buffalo Rumblings Network, Mr. Bruce Nolan. How we doing, Bruce?
Dude, it's a party all the time. Just disco balls, dancers, the whole thing. I literally can't stop myself.
I know in talking pre-show that's you putting on your brave face. So I appreciate you be jumping on with us. You're a busy man, have been on a lot of different shows. And speaking of that, for anybody who's not familiar, you guys should be listening to the Nick and Nolan Show. Outstanding duo between Nick Bat and Bruce over there on the Buff Rumblings Network, who have really, I thought, brought a lot to the Buffalo media world recently, and really stepped forward in the past year here with a really popular show that I'm a big fan of and listen to myself. And really excited to be able to have Bruce on here. And you've probably heard, if you haven't listened, they've done a series of different things, and some kind of explaining some terminology pieces. Bruce is a avid draft connoisseur and likes to get into that world, but also likes to get into some of the financial piece of things that I like to get into, and has done some different things. So before we start diving into all the fun stuff, Bruce, why don't you give us kind of an idea of just your overall thoughts on Brandon Beane, his roster construction and contract strategy, how he's approached this, and so people can get a mindset of how you take a look at these things.
So for me, when I look at the way that Brandon Beane has constructed the roster, I look at things like his contract structure, and I look at things like the years and things that we're going to get into more in depth later. And the thing that really strikes me is that there doesn't seem to ever be any panic with Brandon Beane. I think that's the really big takeaway high level from Brandon Beane, is that there doesn't seem to be any panic. We talk about that a lot when we talk about cornerback play, ironically enough, coming up on the draft. We talk about how things are not always going to go according to plan. And things are not always going to happen exactly as you like them. And maybe you fall out of phase as a corner, or maybe you get shook, but you don't panic. You don't freak out. You don't start grabbing. And that's one of the things that Brandon Beane can do. And that doesn't mean he can't make audibles. I mean, I think we can agree that the Kelvin Benjamin trade was probably an audible for Brandon Beane. It was probably not originally part of the plan for year one of this roster building. But just because you allow yourself the opportunity to audible does not mean that you panic. And that's something that Brandon Beane doesn't do. He doesn't panic. Everything is okay. It's an audible, but it's a calculated audible. It's not like we're going to go out and be reckless. And there's a difference between aggression and recklessness. And I think that whereas some perhaps GMs in Buffalo past that shall remain nameless, I think that this idea that we're always one player away, and we can be reckless this one time with this contract. We can be reckless this one time because we're so close. And I don't really know how much the drought influenced some of that recklessness, but you don't see any of it from Brandon Beane. And I think that overall, not panicking and not being reckless is really kind of the theme of Brandon Beane's. There's a plan for this. There's steps to this. We're going to stay disciplined. We're going to do the things we have to do to make sure we can build a consistent winner.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And I'll use a perfect example. Take Brandon Beane's predecessor and moving to New York, Dave Gettleman. I think an example of the difference between an unplanned audible, like acquiring Kelvin Benjamin, because we are significantly better than where we assumed we would be in that first year and had a legitimate playoff window, versus getting to that off season and now feeling like, well, I gave up legitimate draft capital. I probably should prepare to extend him and sign him to an extension because I need to do that. You look at Dave Gettleman, who gave up a third and a fifth for Leonard Williams. Leonard Williams didn't perform all that well, but they couldn't reach an extension. And instead he panicked and they used a franchise tag on a player that probably wasn't going to get $8 or $10 million on the market. And he gives him 15. Even within that, he could have transition tagged him and just saved $3.5 million for free. And I think that shows the difference between not being so regimented that you can pivot in real time to make an acquisition to show the team that, hey, we're all in here in the front office too, but not being so married to it that you can't move on or make adjustments. So I think it's a great example.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we know that Gettleman has informed Brandon Beane, but we hope he hasn't totally informed him because there are some traits of Dave Gettleman I would very much prefer not to have rubbed off on Brandon Beane. That would be my great preference. I joked around in the mock draft episode with Nick last year before the 2019 draft. I say, we're going to need one or two people in front of us to do something absolutely staggeringly crazy. And then thankfully, Gettleman and Gruden, the OGs, as we like to call them, the OGs decided to take Cleveland frickin' Farrell and Daniel Jones, and that really helped us out a lot. And so I would prefer that not be something maybe that rubbed off on Brandon Beane, but the whole targeting players and trading up for them but never trading back, that part kind of obviously rubbed off on Brandon Beane. But the acquire a player just like Brandon Beane did. You acquire a player midseason because you think maybe you have a chance to fill a hole here with a meaningful player. Brandon Beane extending Kelvin Benjamin after that first year would have been the extent and the equivalent of Gettleman freaking out the way he did. And it's nice to know he didn't do that. And it's nice to know that part of Gettleman didn't rub off on Beane.
Yeah, and we'll get into a couple other things later on here about being flexible and willing to adjust when you see you maybe didn't peg the number right. But as we go to dive in here, one of the first topics that I had put out there for us to kind of dive through something that I've referred to as positional layering, and the idea of preparing the timing of when different contracts come up and when different pieces are moving, of knowing, hey, we have a guy here that we expect to be extended because we see that potential. Obviously, we're about to go into that window for the first time under Brandon Beane, and heck, the first time in a decade that we've actually drafted well enough to need to extend people. So this is a wonderful problem to have. And I think you can look at some of the other contracts that they've laid out and show them as examples of how they're preparing, whether in term, whether the age of the player, whether the dollar amount and the when it expires prior to when that other extension is coming up here. What was an example you'd like to start with to kind of show the strategy he's using there?
I think the Star Latule layering with Ed Oliver, I think, is a good
Yeah.
start. And I think what this reeks of to me, and I mean that in a positive statement, is that it seems to me that there is a positional spending outline that is being followed here. Now, obviously, I can't say that for certain, but that's one of the things that will always keep you afloat is if you say, listen, we're not going to devote more than this percentage of the cap to this particular position group. And so because of that, we can't have a bunch of fat contracts messing up the numbers at the same time. It's okay to have a $10 million a year Star Latule. It's fine to have that. We just can't have that at the same time after we had to pay Ed Oliver. We can have some of these other players. We just can't have them overlapping because then you end up messing up the balance. Much like the Force, you got to have balance in the Force. And so much like the Force, Yoda, Brandon Beane, I'm going really far with this analogy, and I'm not entirely sure I'm comfortable with it because I don't know that much about Star Wars. But the point is that you must preserve balance. And I think that the Star Latule at Oliver Place is a good way to talk about that. But, AJ Klein, you can get out of that the second you have to pay Tremaine Edmonds.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have things like that at different position groups. It might be one of the reasons why Brandon Beane didn't want to pursue a significant cornerback 2 in free agency because he knows he's going to have to pay Tre'Davious White $18 million a year. And maybe his budget for that particular position is $24 million a year. That's his max. He won't go over that or whatever the number is. Obviously, we're using hypotheticals, but maybe that's the case. Maybe that's the reason why CB2, it might just be a rotating door of get by guys just because you're going to have that investment on the other side and you refuse to break rank and mess up your numbers by overspending at a position group and then leaving other position groups by the wayside.
Yeah, I think it really shows that discipline, and we've gotten into that in our Slack channel a couple times, and I don't know that it's a set number, like you referenced 24. I think that it's probably a range that he has, so say whatever that percentage obviously moves as the overall cap moves, but let's say in 2020 or 2021 even, when the extension kicks in, his range for cornerback is 21 to 27 million, and obviously the lower in that range you get, the better off you are. and you can splurge every once in a while in a short term, but you keep it within that range and you are disciplined to the collars of that range. And I think that the couple others that people will reference, most teams don't have the luxury of paying their third and their fourth linebacker a total of $10 million. But when you have both Milano and Edmonds on rookie contracts, you can afford to bring in both AJ Klein and Tyler Matakevich to be able to put that into that ballpark, and you have that luxury of depth. You have the same thing that we can afford to have Ty Secchi and Spencer Long and Darrell Williams because Deion Dawkins and Cody Ford are both on their rookie deals. And as those things come up, that's why people are brought in on 1 and 2 and 3 year deals that are pretty short term. Ty Secchi is going to expire after this year. We have flexibility that, we're pre-draft, we're already 9 guys deep on the offensive line, and it's very likely we see another Wyatt Teller, Russell Bodine type trade at the cutdown day. So I think that he puts himself into that position where, like you said, you have that positional spending, allocation that keeps you disciplined to that and lets you know where you can splurge a little bit and like, hey, we're a little bit low here. We can afford to do that. Obviously, bringing in EJ Gaines isn't one, but it could have been an example where if they had have taken a move going after, a guy who gets released or that comes available, they still leave themselves that wiggle room to be able to do that. And it kind of brings us into this next window here that not only the positional layering, but overall, we are in this really nice window, and everybody always focuses on the quarterback rookie contract window, and that is key. We're going into Josh Allen's third and fourth year, which will both be very cheap, and then hopefully we get to a position where we want the fifth year option, which is not as cheap, but not franchise quarterback money. And it puts us into a spot where you have this luxury window before any of the extensions kick in, and you're able to make some moves that other teams, we just saw the purge that had to happen in Jacksonville, in Minnesota, and all these other rosters where really talented players were given away for nothing or cut outright. What is your thought on how Brandon Beane has used that window in maybe some ways other teams haven't been able to?
Brandon Beane has talked about this since the beginning. He said that I want to win now and I want to win later. He said that with the EJ Gaines trade for Sammy Watkins. He said it when he brought in Jordan Matthews. And I think part of that was let's make sure we get back a player. We're not just shipping off players, right? We're not just tanking for assets. We're also trying to win now and win the future. But it's not about finding a 1-year window. I mean, Jacksonville saw their window come and go, and it's gone. It's over.
Yeah.
The window is closed for Jacksonville. It was there for 1 year. They were a drive away from the Super Bowl, and now it's gone. And I don't think that's necessarily an intelligent way of being able to build a team, because football is a game of probabilities, not possibilities. And because of that, you can have a really good team for 1 year, and if things don't bounce your way, that team might not make the Super Bowl. It's just the way it is. Things don't always go your way. It's not like you have series to play in the playoffs like you do in the NBA. In the NBA, very frequently, the best team is going to win the NBA championship because it's built that way. But that's not the way it is in football. So you need a bigger window. You can't go all in for this window like you can in other sports. You need a bigger window because you have to allow for probabilities to happen. You have to allow for the fact that, listen, even if you have a really good team, that really good team might have a 35% chance of winning the Super Bowl. I mean, a really, really amazing good team, right? Patrick Mahomes gives you a chance to win the Super Bowl year after year after year, not just 1 year. Blake Bortles, if he's propped up by Leonard Fournette and an elite defense, can give you one good shot at it. And so do you want to build your team on the probability that you're going to get a Trent Dilfer scenario or a Brad Johnson scenario or maybe a Wacko for Flacco sort of scenario? No, you want to build it around the fact that you have sustainable success. Part of that's a franchise quarterback problem. But also it's about not letting the now kill the later. And that's what you see from Brandon Beane with a lot of the moves. That I opined openly on social media that, for example, the contract that was given to Vernon Butler seems to me that it's likely that that contract range was probably what was given as an offer to Jordan Phillips.
Yeah.
And he probably didn't take it. We said, okay, we'll move it on. We can find a player we think is a reasonable facsimile for Jordan Phillips, but we can find him at our number. And that number, the fact that I have this number, I have this, like you talk about a range, right? That's important. That's really important. Somebody in the Slack channel just mentioned the Rams. goodness gracious, what is going on with the Rams?
Oh,
The Rams have literally no assets, right? They have nothing going on. Their window was like 8 seconds. They're like, oh my gosh, they got this genius coach and this star running back and this quarterback who they're going to pay $1 bajillion. And then all of a sudden, it just all goes to crap. And that's not the way to win a Super Bowl. The way to win a Super Bowl is to keep the window open as long as you possibly can and to have a long window. And you do that by making intelligent decisions.
so a quick aside, somebody did the financial breakdown that if the Rams had simply stuck to their guns, let Todd Gurley's rookie contract go out with the 5th-year extension, and then let him walk in free agency and likely gotten a comp pick back instead by renegotiating with 2 full seasons left on his contract. Todd Gurley ended up getting from the Rams $22 million more over the same time frame that he simply would have had a rookie deal and a 5th-year option. And it's just mind-boggling that it's sad or not, running back, I think you've gone back and forth with me on Twitter with this, you kind of threading the needle of nuance with what happens with running backs. And it's not that running backs don't matter, but you should never give them that much money. And for them to accelerate that when you still had him on a rookie contract was just unbelievable to let them get to that spot. And it's crazy. And now Ron was bringing it up here in the chat about it's that discipline that the Patriots always are, that year too early, not a year too late. And obviously I think everyone will find out if that's the case with Tom Brady, but it wouldn't be crazy that they end up looking like the smarter end of that deal. But with Todd Gurley and the Rams, it's crazy to see that. And I wonder, we just saw Byron Jones have to walk from Dallas because they couldn't afford to stick to their guns with Ezekiel Elliott and had to give him $90 million to do that. And it's one of those things that we probably need to brace ourselves that it doesn't seem that Brandon Beane is going to do that. And that maybe we do see a draft pick this year at running back and maybe another one in 2 years, because we shouldn't get married to the idea of Devin Singletary on a second contract or a huge extension, and that there's trade-off to that kind of discipline. But that thus far, Brandon Beane's shown that discipline to be able to do that. And I think that this 2 to 3 year window that we're seeing here is nice, where you're able to add on, kind of a superfluous Quentin Jefferson, that we replaced Mario Addison in for Shaq Lawson. We replaced Vernon Butler in for Jordan Phillips. And hey, let's throw Quentin Jefferson in there just for fun. Hey, let's go out and get a, $3.5–4 million a year special teams guy because, well, Zoe was really good at that. And we don't want to take a step back here. Let's go ahead and, add that on. And being able to go and make some of those moves, or, hey, Darrell Williams has sat out there for a while. We think we can get him pretty cheap. Let's add him in here, see if he can rekindle anything that's out there. That luxury spending in a disciplined, team-friendly structure in this window is exactly what Brandon Beane has set up to where, I would love if we had a little bit more of the elite talent that's out there in some of the other teams. But I think that we're very much going to have the deepest roster in the NFL, and arguably one of the top ones. Even PFF, who likes to poke at the Bills, I think 2 of the guys that have some of the most fun at the Bills' expense, Kevin specifically over at PFF, listed them as the 4th best roster in the NFL right now. And I don't think that's off. I think that I always refer to the other 52, a quarterback independent roster. I think we arguably have the best roster in the NFL. And that it's crazy that Brandon Beane's been able to do that in, 3.5 seasons and 3 off seasons of his control to be able to do that. And as we kind of transition into this next phase, how do you think that translates into how you go from this luxury window to then building a roster into the future that can still sustain when you're starting to have to pay some of those players?
Really, it comes down to your ability to draft well. And you're drafting well versus not drafting well will end your cycle real quick. You can't build a team through free agency. You just can't do it. You can apply good players to free agency, but based on the economics alone, you cannot build a team through free agency, because a player you acquire via free agency will be overpaid relative to that same player you'd be able to acquire via draft pick. That's just the way free agency works. And so if you think about it like a cycle, if you draft well and you extend those players, the more you extend, the less holes you have. The less holes you have, the less you have to spend on unrestricted free agents to plug the holes. The less you have to spend on unrestricted free agents to fill the holes, the more comp picks you get. The more comp picks you get, plus the better drafting equals the less holes. And now we start all over again. Yep. So now we have this cycle, and it really all boils down to, if you cannot draft well, you're toast. You just are. And now you can make it a discussion as to what constitutes drafting well. You and I think have talked about that, the difference between 30% hit rate and a 45% hit rate is like staggering when it comes to Brandon Beane, and he's hitting markedly above his weight class right now when it comes to hitting on draft picks. And maybe he's just a really good drafter. Maybe he's going to regress to the mean. We don't know that. But really, it's a lifeblood issue. You have to keep it coming, because if you don't keep the talent coming into the organization, it forces you to hang on to people that you otherwise would be more responsibly to let go. And that's the problem. You can't pay everybody. And so part of it is there a scenario where Deion Dawkins, for example, gets paid and Matt Milano walks? Not because we don't want to pay Matt Milano, because we have faith we can draft someone to be able to get you a reasonable facsimile for Matt Milano. However, we know full well that Deion Dawkins is a very serviceable left tackle. And nowadays, from a scarcity standpoint, offensive line play is not great, Bob, in the NFL right now. It is difficult to play offensive line and to draft offensive line well. Don't let this particular offensive tackle class mess with your head, because it's not always like that. And so if you cannot draft well, if you cannot acquire cheap talent efficiently, the whole thing's going to come off the rails.
Well, and I think I'll give a couple examples where he had that option. And I think that, he took 2 stabs at the safety realm. And, we had Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer under very team-friendly structures over a long period of time. We still drafted Saran Neal. The next year, we drafted Jaquan Johnson. And that, you go through those trying to check. And I still think there's a chance we might have hit on something with Jaquan. But you kind of validated that, okay, Saran Neal's probably not a starting caliber safety. He's a roster caliber player with his versatility and special teams ability. But if we lose Jordan Poyer, Saran Neal's likely not the answer for that. They internally know the answer of whether they probably could have rolled the dice and played hardball. And my interpretation is, after seeing the numbers that came back that really are spreading out to a lot closer to 3 years at $8 million a year for Jordan Poyer. They added on the 2 and 20.5 overall, but a lot of that was brought forward into this year to give him a well-deserved pay raise. That I think that he basically agreed to a number that they couldn't say no to, but that they had prepared that if they couldn't reach that agreement and say Poyer was looking for, no, I want $12.5 million and I want $12.5 million over all 3 years, they could have remained disciplined to that, to do that. Now, I don't know that I think that they've brought that player in at linebacker yet, but that's the same structure they could go after. And heck, we may find that out in 4 weeks from now, that all of a sudden we have the luxury of that. Now, we don't know exactly what the team thinks they have in a Dodson, coming off the practice squad, or Voshan Joseph coming back from IR, or maybe another step from Corey Thompson. I personally don't see that in any of those 3, but all of a sudden you're going to get in that same window. They're going to go through the draft. Maybe all of a sudden Akeem Davis-Gaither is available in the 4th or 5th round. And all of a sudden we have a safety net, and that we can go in, set our number, be able to discuss with Matt Milano what we think makes sense, and that, hey, we think you're closer to 10 or 11 million, and we're offering 4 years and 42 million, and they're thinking 4 years and 52 million. All of a sudden you can hold a little firmer to that if you have the safety net in place. But that's all dependent on hitting on those picks and being able to bring those guys forward to be able to, materially contribute to what you're looking for. And I think that transition of being able to go from drafting well and supplementing with free agency into paying those players and needing to supplement with the draft is the real sign of a truly sustainable front office. And that's where Baltimore has transitioned long term. And it went from Ozzie Newsome to Eric DaCosta, and what you've seen in Green Bay, what you've seen in Pittsburgh, where they've started to have to pay some of these higher name players that they drafted well on, and then they're able to supplement. And you saw it in Green Bay last year, where they finally cycled through and they had a window to spend. They spent smartly, and they brought in Preston Smith and Zadarius Smith, who were a home run free agent signing. And being able to do that is really going to be the test of this next phase. I think, obviously, in any objective view, Brandon Beane has passed every test thus far. Even the contracts that weren't ideal, he found ways to restructure, and everything else has been not perfect, but well above average in that. I think that next test is going to be, can he transition into re-signing the right players and continuing to draft well enough to supplement that roster below them? And speaking of how they're signing those right players and building some of that, I think a lot of people in the media and fans throw around the term team-friendly structure. Why don't we give the guys listening some thoughts on, what do you see what is an example of that when people throw around, oh, Brandon Beane was able to get a team-friendly structure?
In the NFL, everything is reported as total potential years and total potential dollars. Everything. That's just the way it is. And you can react based on that, but your reactions based on that always have to be taken with a grain of salt, because when something is reported as a 5-year, $50 million contract, that doesn't really tell you anything. There are no 5-year contracts in the NFL, not really. Everything is a 1 year and let's see, 2 years and let's see, 3 years and let's see. One of the reasons you and I rip on the Todd Gurley contract is because they gave a running back basically 4 years and let's see. I mean, it's a horrible contract. It is. If you want to get out of that contract early, tough luck. You gotta hit through $20 million dead cap hits, and that's really about roster flexibility down the road. Things change rapidly in the NFL, and if you're not structuring the contracts in such a way that allow you as a GM and as a front office to change rapidly when opportunity presents itself, or when a negative opportunity is thrust upon you, you're going to be put in a bad scenario. If you have a player who absolutely hits a wall, say, for example, a running back, for example, and you can't get out from that contract, that's now a bad contract. It doesn't matter whether or not he did really well that last year. It doesn't matter what the total value of the contract was. You can't get out without harming your team. I think you and I talked about, people were talking about Khalil Mack, and they're trading Khalil Mack, and he had a ridiculous cap hit if they trade him. And that's essentially a no trade clause. That's essentially what these big cap hits are. And having big cap hits, fine. The issue is, when can I get out of this contract? That's the issue. And with Brandon Beane specifically, one of the ways he kind of lessens that is by inserting roster bonuses year 1 and year 2 in lieu of larger signing bonuses. So from a player's money standpoint, it looks like almost identical. But he decides, listen, I'm going to take the cap hit now rather than taking the cap hit maybe later when I don't know what the uncertain future is going to look like. I know how much money I have right now. I know that for sure. So I'm going to go ahead and take this on the nose year 1, so I can make sure that I have the necessary flexibility to be able to get out from this contract year 2 or year 3. There are no 4 years and let's see contracts with Brandon Beane. Not a single one. You could make an argument Star Latule's contract is the worst contract that Brandon Beane has even come close to signing, and he restructured it. But
Yeah.
that was a scenario where, I think that was a desperation move on Brandon Beane's part. I think that was hey, we need to make sure that we inject a message carrier here at a position of need. Bring him from Carolina. He's process AF as far as Star Latule goes, and we really, really want this guy and cannot possibly live without him. And we can argue as to whether or not that was a smart move or not. But aside from that, it really is a 1 year and let's see, 2 years and let's see. And the reason that allows him to do that is because the signing bonus proration isn't ridiculous.
Well, and I think that there's a couple examples that come up. One, the Jordan Poyer extension they just did. They could have easily done that as a kick the can down the road 2 years and 20 million where they gave him a little signing bonus now, but instead Brandon Beane is a huge advocate of the roster bonus. Almost every contract has had equal or greater roster bonus than signing bonus. Roster bonus, you eat all that money now. The player gets it now just like they would, and he actually does a tricky thing where he puts it 5 or 7 days after the league year, so technically they have to wait like a week to get their signing bonus versus literally the day of the signing. But instead of kicking that can down the road financially, and for any fan who's listening who isn't familiar, a signing bonus you prorate over each year of the contract. So a $9 million signing bonus on a 3-year deal, the player gets that $9 million on day one, but you have $3 million of that each year over the 3 years. If you cut that guy the second year, you now have $6 million left of dead cap because you had spread it out over the 3 years. If instead you give the player a $3 million signing bonus and a $6 million roster bonus, it does take $7 million of that in the first year. The player still gets $9 million up front. It's technically $3 million on day one and $6 million on day 7, but he gets that $9 million up front. However, in the second year, you now have the option to move away and you only have $2 million in dead cap rather than $6 million in dead cap. That same function, if you can afford it, if you maintain the roster flexibility and financial flexibility in the year to eat that 7 million versus the 3 million that you would have, you can still structure that around a lower base salary. You can structure that around other pieces. Brandon Beane consistently leans that direction. Every time an announcement comes up, I always warn everyone and say that, hey, the rosy optimal numbers that come out initially are always leaked by an agent over to a news source or directly from an agent. Now that's the hot new thing, is the agent tweets it directly. Wait for the details. The devil is always in the details when the numbers come out. Every single contract that came out was a little bit better than what it was. The initial numbers on Vernon Butler were, 2 years and 19 million. Well, it's really 2 years and 14 million and about 7 million a year. The initial numbers on Tyler Medikevich was 2 years and 9 million. Well, it's really closer to 2 years and 7 million. Take a player that got released recently, and you talked about that initial number. A running back here in Atlanta, Devonta Freeman. His agent waved the flag of, hey, we got him 5 years and $41.2 million. Well, he played there for 3 years. He collected 3 years and $21 million. He never got the other $20 million of that announced number. They released him after the 3 years. He moves on, and he really got a 3-year, $21 million deal. So the way that they do that, look at the restructure that happened for Tyler Kroft. Tyler Kroft's number was initially going to be announced as a 3-year, $18.5 million deal. Now it's a 2-year, $11 million deal. That kind of ability to manage the number in the year, take your medicine now, don't kick the can down the road, be able to maintain that financial and roster flexibility is what allows him to pivot within the year. We don't have these albatross contracts. Even some of the ones that aren't ideal, he restructured. We got pay cuts back from Starr, from Tyler Kroft, from Pat DeMarco. And being in that kind of position is how he can continue to add this much talent to the roster and continue to do it in a team structured way. And the way that I explained how he juggles what I consider a little bit of a loophole. And if you're financially disciplined, you can use that. Teams like the Rams, the Jaguars, the Vikings can't afford to do roster bonuses because they don't have the current year cap space to do it. Brandon Beane is able to do that and take advantage of it now, eat that money up front. The player still gets the check. They don't honestly care if they get the check day 1 or day 7. They're still getting a huge check up front. Doing it in a roster bonus takes advantage of it now, doesn't kick the can down the road, and is able to maintain that flexibility in the future. That brings us into something that I know you and I are huge fans of. You hear Joe Buscaglia talk about it a lot, and I jokingly call it comp pick bingo. And it's a current system in the NFL that I think there was some rumor that may not be included in the new CBA. It ended up continuing to be included. And I think with a front office as deep as what we have and a GM as savvy as what Brandon Beane is, we will absolutely see it come into play. And what comp picks are is if you have a net loss in free agency, so unrestricted free agents who sign within the normal window from the start of free agency, usually until about mid-May. It was May 15th last year. that anyone who signs there, if you have more players leave your team and sign with other teams than what you bring in, you get a compensatory pick for each player above that. Now, there's an equation that nets out higher price guys. This year, everybody who was about above 12 million ended up a third round pick. Between like 8 and 12 was a fourth round pick. Between like 5 and 8 was a fifth round pick, and then a lower scale throughout there. And the way that that nets out, it lets teams who draft and develop talented players who leave and go elsewhere to get some kickback in there, and you get a trade-off. The biggest one was last year. The Patriots let both Trent Brown and Trey Flowers sign enormous deals with Oakland and Detroit respectively. They got 2 extra third-round picks, and they ended up being around pick 98 and pick 100. That would be awful nice to be able to have that tacked on. What are some ways you think we might see Brandon Beane start to utilize that going forward?
This is going to sound really horrible when I say it, but I think Matt Milano might be a prime target for something like
Yeah.
this. Because I think that a 4-3 weak side linebacker isn't going to have a super amount of value to specific teams, but there are going to be some teams who run some semblance of this type of defense. Think about teams like Minnesota, teams like the Giants, teams who really value what that weak side run and chase linebacker brings. And this is where you have to weight the value of paying the player you have market versus replacing them with a draft pick and then also getting a draft pick back. And Matt Milano is one of these players. I'm not pounding the table to let Matt Milano walk. I'm just saying that when you think about Trey White, Deion Dawkins, Matt Milano, you start to add these people together, Milano starts to take a back seat. And as you start to rotate, you can't keep everybody. And not everybody is going to be a free agent in the year when we invest significant resources in the position. That's one of the other things we got to talk about, is that our propensity for getting free agents is going to go down when we start paying the current players on our roster, because we're not going to have the money. The last 2 years of free agency have gotten us from what I would consider to be a historically bad roster to what you just said was one of the best rosters in the league, and what PFF just stated was probably the 4th best roster in the league. 2 years, Greg.
Yeah.
2 years from this is one of the worst rosters I've ever seen ever, and not a single player on our offense is even in the league anymore. That's how bad it is. None of the receivers are even
That's so sad.
I mean, it's awful. It is absolutely awful. You know, John Miller's getting cut from the Bengals right after he gets signed there, and
Yeah.
Kelvin Benjamin's not in the league. Jeremy Curley, where's Jeremy Curley? You know, it's one of those
Andre Holmes.
things where Andre Holmes. And so you go from having that to having one of the most talented rosters in the league, and you can do that quickly with free agency. But that's not always going to be the case, which opens up the door as your expenditures in free agency go down. Your propensity for getting comp picks goes up because you're losing people out the back end. Instead of replacing them in free agency, you're replacing them in the draft. So as it starts now, I think that the first realistic target, and someone who I think might end up getting big money, like bigger than Jordan Phillips, bigger than Shaq Lawson sort of money. And mind you, it was a year right now where Shaq Lawson and Jordan Phillips left us, but we didn't have the free agency expenditures that we did. Then maybe we could talk about potentially getting some comp picks. And so think about it this way. Think about the losses this year, but without the gains, because we're bringing those people in with draft picks. That's where you start to get these comp picks.
Yeah, let's say now Brandon Beane, I do respect the fact that if you're going to miss, don't miss by that much. That's what was annoying about that first year, where I think honestly, if Brandon Beane was there, some of those signings that we had when it was, a kicker and a punter and a fullback and a weird special teams receiver and just positions like that we probably could have waited until after the May 15th window and gotten a comp pick back for specifically Stephon Gilmore's enormous deal that would have been a free third round pick. I think he has the discipline to do that. I'm going to give a couple other examples. I think Matt Milano is the most obvious one right now. I don't think it's very likely that Deion Dawkins leaves. I think that one's almost a for sure thing. He's so prominent from a team marketing standpoint, team elected captain, a sustainable position. I think that Deion Dawkins and Trey White are back here, honestly, 95% plus. Matt Milano, I think, is greater than 50-50. but I think he's closer to 60% that he's back, and there's a real possibility that he may not. I'm going to give a couple other examples. Let's say in the draft, all of a sudden we see an Amik Robertson, and he falls to the right pick in the 4th or 5th round or something like that. All of a sudden, maybe Taron Johnson walks when his contract comes up. Let's say we bring in a Bryce Hall, or we get lucky and Trayvon Diggs falls, or whoever it might be at the outside. All of a sudden, you still bring Levi Wallace back as a restricted free agent next year, but then you let him walk. You look at a position like, hey, we get lucky and somehow Ross Blacklock falls to 54. And all of a sudden, then when Harrison Phillips' contract comes up, you could let him walk. Now, I'm not advocating that I want to get rid of Harry or Taron Johnson or Levi Wallace, but that's how good teams build that, is that as those guys develop, well, we already drafted a guy that can probably take your spot and do just as well or better. So we wish you all the best. And hey, we hope you get paid a ton, because the more you get paid, the better comp pick we get. That's how you build comp picks. You also do it by structuring 1 and 2 year deals. So all of a sudden, Tyler Croft is a perfect example. It was a very sneaky part of that restructure that Brandon Beane did. And instead of having a weird voidable year in the future, or a kick the can down the road hollow year with a really low dead cap where everyone knows he's going to get released, they renegotiated that next year, this is the last year of his deal. If Tyler Croft walks this next year and signs with another team next year as an unrestricted free agent, he's now comp pick eligible. When you bring in guys like a Vernon Butler, a Quentin Jefferson, that are going to be coming up as Ed Oliver's coming up on his new deal, or whatever defensive end we draft here and comes up the same year that Mario Addison's ready to come up. When you structure it in a way that the contract is still palatable, and you're not having some balloon payment final year that's kicked way down the road and that is just a crazy trigger for a release, and you let players fulfill their contract when they leave on those shorter term deals, you're now also adding in to the overall net that you can afford to do what we did this year. We re-signed Quentin Spain. That was a positive. But if we were in that position and say this was next year, and those guys were in there along with Matt Milano, and all of a sudden we re-signed Quentin Spain, but next year maybe we dabble a little bit more in the released players. If a player is released from his contract, they don't count in the comp pick equation. And all of a sudden we sign a couple of released players, we draft well, we re-sign a lot of our own, but now it was letting Jordan Phillips go and Shaq Lawson go and Kevin Johnson go, and now it's Matt Milano go. And instead we see that the contract gets really overwhelming for, some other good linebacker that gets cut. All of a sudden we sign that guy who got released, bring him aboard, that doesn't count against it, and now all of a sudden you're netting out comp picks for where Matt Milano came in. So I think it's a important option to leave open. I don't think that Brandon Beane's ever going to value comp picks ahead of talent. I think it's going to be a peripheral bonus, a silver lining, that if it works out that we've structured the team well enough, we think we have the re-signings happening, we see enough guys out there on that fringe released market, and you could go build a structure of, hey, we could go sign Linval Joseph instead of Vernon Butler. We could go out there and sign, Pierre Desir instead of EJ Gaines or Josh Norman was a comp pick neutral player. I think that they set those up to be able to do that. And if Brandon Beane feels like we can still field the team we want, then it's worth the discipline to hold off and say, yeah, let's see if we can just stay in this release market, make sure we net that out, and now we get the 3rd rounder back for Matt Milano leaving, and you're able to do that. So any other examples that you think would point out how you might play that?
I mean, that's really the difference right there, what you just mentioned. It's the difference between acquiring cap relief from contracts expiring and acquiring cap relief from cutting people. The more cap relief you have to acquire as a team by cutting people, the less likely you are to ever have any comp pick issues, because when you cut someone, it doesn't count.
Doesn't
so
help you.
When you have teams who need to cut players to get cap relief, that's not good. But with these shorter term contracts, it's really a win for everybody involved, because if you think about it this way, you're the agent and I'm Brandon Beane, and I say, Mr. and Mrs. Agent, your player is going to come here. And I really feel like he's going to be successful for us. And that means he's going to be able to hit the free agent market again in his prime. So we're not going to sign him to a 6-year contract or a 5-year contract or 4-year. We're going to sign him to a 2-year contract. We think he's going to play really well here, and he's still going to hit the market when he's 29 years old. How does that sound, Mr. Age? Oh, it sounds great. It's a win for everybody involved, because on your end, you think, gosh, that's an opportunity for another payday. And for me, I'm thinking, I'm going to get cap relief without having to cut you, because it's the difference between, oh my gosh, this guy is underwhelming, or oh my gosh, I've got to get out from this contract, versus if it's structured correctly, you can just wait him out. Yeah. Someone like Trent Murphy, we don't have to cut Trent Murphy right now. We can cut Trent Murphy if we want to get $8 million in cap space, but we don't have to. We can wait him out. And when we wait him out, he becomes a valuable asset to us in the form of getting a comp pick back. Now, I don't know what our free agency plans next year are going to look like, so I have no clue if he's even going to factor into that. But if you have enough of those decisions that stack on top of each other, and you're getting cap relief from the fact that you have contracts dropping off, that's way better than acquiring that same amount of cap relief by cutting players.
Well, and if I'm Brandon Beane, and I'm sure that Dan Morgan and Joe Shane and the rest of the team, they're using Jordan Phillips as a sales pitch to say, hey, this is a player that was in such a poor organizational structure in Miami that they waived him. He came to Buffalo. We put him into the best position to be his best self, and he just went and got 4 years and $40 million. Do you want that for your client? Do you want to come to the place that's going to take care of you physically, put you into a good, sustainable structure, only put you on the field for snaps that you're going to be capable of playing, and to put your best film out there, and then go maximize yourself on the market? Because that's what we want for you. If you want to come here and play well, play in the role that we provide for you, thrive and maximize your opportunity within that role, and then go get paid, we all win. Come aboard and come do that. That example that some fans are like, oh man, that must have been tough to be able to lose that. No, that's a sales pitch. That's a positive that they can now give a real world testimonial to, hey, look what can happen if you come to Buffalo and play well. And obviously I'm hoping that they now have the flip side of that coin with what I think are going to be substantial extensions for Trey White, for, Deion Dawkins, we'll see for Matt Milano. Also for Jordan Poyer. Hey, Jordan Poyer came here and signed an under market deal, outperformed that for 3 of the 4 years. And you want to know what? We recognize that. And in the 4th year, we took care of him. Plus, we added on 2 more deserved years. And now he's going to be compensated for that work that he did, because you can come to Buffalo on a value deal at the time where we're taking a risk on your injury history and your opportunity. And if you play well, we'll take care of you there too. I think that there's value in the locker room seeing that. I think they pay attention to who we pay. It's the same thing. Some fans are like, man, I hope we can get Trey White done now, because I want to get him in cheaper before the rest of the guys come there. Honestly, the net difference in Trey White for $16.5 million and Trey White for $18 million, what are we doing with that $1.5 million? That's not even a Taiwan Jones. That's not even an EJ Gaines. I don't care about that $1.5 million. I do kind of care that players see that, oh, if I get drafted in Buffalo and I ball out and play as an all-pro, I can become the highest paid player at my position. I almost think there's more equity in the value of that message in the locker room than the 750,000 or 1.25 million haggling between what Marlon Humphrey gets or Marcus Lattimore gets or Jalen Ramsey gets. In that, I think the message of doing that shows that we're going to take care of our players and reward them if you play really well.
You just had to get another shot in there at the Rams by mentioning Jalen Ramsey trading for a player and not getting the extension done with him, and now he holds you over the barrel. Yeah, good.
Or Laramie Tunsil.
Any opportunity I have to make fun of the Texans or the Rams management of their front offices, I'm going to take it. So just any softballs that you want to throw me, I'm down for it. But it's not just preaching to the locker room too. You mentioned the Trey White thing and how it plays in a locker room. That crap matters for agents, and that stuff matters across the league. You say, listen, think about the trouble that the New York Jets and the Washington Redskins are going to have after their issues with their medical staffs, with Trent Williams, and the issues with the medical staffs in New York. And the fact of the matter is, you can't find people who want to go there because it soured the well. These agents, it's a smaller community than people think in the NFL. And these agents all know each other, and the agents represent multiple different clients. And there's a buzz about the Bills, and there's a buzz about, it could be negative or positive. There's a buzz about the Jets. If you go to Washington, you better watch out because you might have cancer on your head and they might misdiagnose it and then try and force you to play through it. And so it's one of those scenarios where this is the structure that the Bills are starting to build here. Is if you come here, okay, Sean McDermott made this pitch about being your best self ever. That may not be what we think it is. That pitch that he gave may not be we're going to make you a good man. It's not the same pitch that a college coach gives to a mom and dad in a kitchen saying, I'm going to take care of your son and I'm going to turn him into a man. That's not the same pitch. It's, hey, dude, we're going to help you take care of your body really well. We're going to put you in a position to succeed, and then we're going to wish you well, and either we're going to pay you, Jordan Poyer, or you're going to get paid somewhere else, Jordan Phillips.
Absolutely. And I think that, like you talked about, the agents do care about that. The agents do care about their 2-month window to wave the flag that, hey, I just got my guy the highest paid position contract in his slot. And being able to do that helps build that relationship in the future. And the chat this whole time we've been talking, they've been going back and forth about Yannick Ngakoue. So as a quick audible here at the end before we sign off, I mentioned this in the Slack channel earlier for some of the guys in the chat. I actually think that there was a window where we could have done that. No scenario where Bruce and I just talked for almost an hour here about how disciplined and regimented Brandon Beane is, and that he is willing to audible here, and I'll give that in a moment. But there's no scenario where he goes out and spends roughly $24 million in 2020 on Yannick Ngakoue or on Mario Addison, Quentin Jefferson, and Vernon Butler, and goes out and gives Yannick Ngakoue $20 million. Now, if things get ugly and you get to where they get past the franchise tag window, where now they're ineligible from negotiating an extension, and so is any acquiring team, which is exactly what happened to Jadeveon Clowney last year. You now get into the window where his price tag is purely the rental cost. Last year, that for Houston was a third, a fifth, and two kind of rotational backup style players. Then you get into a spot where if you're talking about a 2021 third and fifth, and then in our world, that's probably Trent Murphy and Daryl Johnson. And you're sending those guys over to where just the $17 million cap hit offset by the $8 million in Trent Murphy's deal. I guess there's some scenario where that's possible, where you could technically figure it out to eat the $9 million into this year's cap. But I think that a lot of people are hoping that there's some window where we do that quickly here. One, the cost is still way too high for what Jacksonville's asking for, and the only scenario would be waiting it out, making sure nobody else does that, and then Ngakoue makes it specifically painful, publicly saying he won't go back to Jacksonville after the franchise tag window has happened, and that trade would happen in training camp in that time frame. So I don't know if you've had any other discussions about Ngakoue, Bruce, or anything. I know you were also a fan of his, pre-free agency, but I don't know if you think there's still a window or if you agree that ship has kind of sailed.
I think if I were Brandon Beane and I was thinking about potentially acquiring Yannick Ngakoue, I think it would be really dependent on what my plans were previously for the 2021 offseason. If I thought that we were going to expend the resources in the 2021 offseason that we did in the 2020 offseason and the 2019 offseason in regards to free agency dollars, I would not acquire Yannick Ngakoue. However, if we weren't planning on doing that, if it was 2 years of building up fairly notably in free agency, and then this is where we start the whole draft and comp pick scenario, then if you want me to toss a third for Yannick Ngakoue, I'm willing to do it. And here's the reason why. We get him on a rental. He leaves and signs a bonkers deal somewhere else. We get that third back anyway.
Yeah.
And so if that was part of the plan, if part of the plan was for 2021 to not have the level of free agent signing and the real level of free agent motion that we saw in 19 and 20, then yeah, let's get that, wait for that, clock to run out essentially on the long-term extension and give them a reduced cost the way that happened a la Jadeveon Clowney. If the plan was to also have a third year of notable free agency investment, then no, now I'm not interested anymore, because that's not going to have any value to me. Having him bring him in for 1 year and then having him need to be extended in a year when I'm also going to talk about Deion Dawkins, and I also have Matt Milano, and I have Tre'Davious White, who I have to start talking to. I don't want to have Yannick Ngakoue added on that list. I want to be able to say, yes, you can go, and I'm okay with that. I want your departure, Mr. Ngakoue, to be part of the plan, because if he doesn't sign, we still get a third back if we don't spend a bunch in free agency and offset the contract he gets somewhere else. Now, if that was part of the plan, then okay. But if 2021 was also going to be a year where we're still going to spend on the free agent market, then no, I'm not interested anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's where it is right now. So any of the fans listening or the guys in the chat, right now, I think that Ngakoue is very much in that Frank Clark, D Ford price range. In that, Frank Clark was a first, a second, and a third round swap. D Ford was a second, a fourth, and a future third. Somewhere in there of 2 day 2 picks, or 2 day 1, day 2 picks, first, second round picks, plus some extra. I think there's every reason that Jacksonville is holding firmly to that price tag. So I don't see any scenario we're doing that right now. I don't see a scenario where Brandon Beane is trading away back-to-back first-round picks, even for elite talents like Stephon Diggs and Yannick Ngakoue. I don't see any scenario in the structure of losing the cost control of that 2 years in a row. However, the one caveat would be for any Bills fan who's holding out hope that the Bills are still able to acquire him. Cross your fingers that we get a Jadeveon Clowney situation, that no other team ponies up that much capital for Ngakoue, that Ngakoue continues to be very vocal in his desire not to return to Jacksonville, that we get past that deadline, which off the top of my head is July 15th. I don't know that for certain, but I think that's the ballpark, that July 15th is the deadline to reach an extension with a franchise tagged player. And if you get beyond that date, no team is allowed to negotiate there, and you have to play out the season under the franchise tag. If we get to that window, I think that's where it's worthwhile. And that's where the price tag comes down. You get to a third and a fifth, something like that. You're able to include Trent Murphy or release him and offset half of Ngakoue's cost. You're able to add in a couple of fringe players we would have traded anyways. And then you're able to have that injection at that point. So I think that's also very low probability. I know I'm not predicting that happens, but that's the only scenario where I could see that it's possible to get them. And then as Bruce laid out, that adds into the offset where all of a sudden, we could now re-sign Tre'Davious, re-sign Matt Milano, re-sign Deion Dawkins, and let some of these other guys walk, and still recoup some comp picks, especially if they're led by Yannick Ngakoue. So this is a great discussion, Bruce. I really appreciate it. Let the people know what else you got coming up, or any closing thoughts on what we talked about.
First off, thanks so much for having me. This has been a long time coming. We probably should have done this last year, but you coming on the Nick and Nolan Show, I really appreciate you being on our show as well. And so this is kind of a home and home sort of a sort of college football scenario here. So I really appreciate you having me. It was a good time. Thanks to all the people in the group chat having a chat with us. This has been a unique experience for me. This is my first time doing this particular type of thing. So I appreciate them all joining in and being part of the conversation. You can find me on Twitter at Bruce Exclusive. I'm sure if you're following Greg, you're probably seeing our back and forths at some point there on the Twitter machine. But actually, tomorrow and Friday, new episodes of the Nick and Nolan Show will be dropping. And one of them is going to be about running backs, and the other one is going to be about wide receiver route concepts and how Stephon Diggs fits into some of the route concepts that Brian Daboll likes to run. So one of them will be a little bit more X's and O's, and the other one's going to be philosophically based. And that philosophically based piece is based on a big 2,500 word article that I wrote for Buffalo Rumblings, which you can actually find at buffalorumblings.com right now.
Awesome. And for anybody who's not, please check out, like I said, at Bruce Exclusive, at Nick Bat. The Nick and Nolan Show is on the Buff Rumblings feed. They do a concept where they put all the shows into one feed, and it's kind of a nice buffet that you can go in and subscribe and pick out the shows that you want. There's a lot of really sharp shows in that feed, and I won't lie, my favorite is the Nick and Nolan Show. So appreciate it very much, Bruce. Really enjoy being able to go back and forth. You're the exact kind of guy I want to talk to here. So in this series, we've had Joe Biscaglia on, we had Brad from overthecap.com. We've now had Bruce on, and I think it's really brought a lot of, different perspective and insight into the way that Brandon Beane has gone about building this roster and giving hope for why Bills fans should genuinely be optimistic. It doesn't mean he's going to continue to hit at the rate he is. It doesn't mean every contract's going to be perfect. But I think it shows that the odds are in our favor, that we have a guy who's making more good decisions than bad. And that's a reason to have hope and optimism here. So for Bruce, this has been Greg. We've had a good time. You've been listening to Cover One Buffalo, and we are out.